Hello kids, this is your video lesson of the day, and today we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. Specifically, advantages and disadvantages of the war for the Americans and the British. Okay, vocab today, we have 4 words, and the first one is loyalist. A loyalist, they were colonists who remained faithful to Britain. 8th grade definition, people who did not want freedom. And loyalists did not consider unfair taxes a good reason for a rebellion. Our second word, as you probably guessed, is patriot. So the Patriots were colonists who supported independence. They wanted to be free, and they were fighting the strongest army in the world and could lose everything if they lost. Our next word is neutral. Taking no side in a conflict. Not taking sides. Many colonists, when faced with the decision of choosing a side during the war, chose to remain neutral. Whose side are you on?
Nobody's. I'm neutral.
Mercenaries. Here's a picture of a mercenary. Hired soldiers. Soldiers who are paid to fight. The British used mercenaries to help them fight in the American Revolution. They are paying me to fight? Alright, I've been teaching this unit for a number of years now, and I've been doing all kinds of neat stuff. Well, I sometimes forget that this question's on the test, so I wanted to go over it from the very beginning. What is the American Revolution? The American Revolution is a war between the American colonies and Britain for independence. What were the first battles of that war? Lexington and Concord. And the historical significance of Lexington and Concord is it was the fighting that signaled the start of the American Revolution. What was the second battle? Bunker Hill. What's the historical significance? 2 things. First, it proved the Patriots would not give up easily against the British Army. And second, it proved that the Patriots would need to secure more supplies to be successful. And in this sentence, the word secure means to get. Opposing sides, both the British and the Americans believed the war would be short. The British thought they would win by sheer force. The Americans thought the British would give up after losing 1 or 2 major battles. John Adams, future 2nd president, said this: "We shall have a long and bloody war to go through." Not many people believed what John Adams said, but the war lasted 8 years, and he was right. They went through a long, bloody war. All right, loyalists. Loyalists were people who remained loyal to Britain, and they were also called Tories. Tories was a political party amongst the British, so if you were a Tory, you were a loyalist. At least 1 in every 5 Americans were loyalists, and in some places 1 in 3. Now, most of the loyalists lived down in the South, down in the Carolinas and down in Georgia. And the weakest loyalist concentration was in the North. Now, I want you to think about this a little bit. Most of the Patriots or the strongest concentration of patriots were in the north, and the strongest concentration of loyalists were in the south. That's foreshadowing for something that's going to happen 100 years from where we're talking about. The Civil War happens in 100 years, and who's that war between? The North and the South. So, from the very beginning of this country, or even before it was a country, there were some differences between the people of the South and the people of the North. So, reasons they stayed loyal to Britain. First of all, religion. The king was the head of the Anglican Church, and most British people were Anglican. So, they didn't want to go against their religion. They didn't want to go against their religious leader. People still do that today. They do things for religious reasons, so that's a big one. They depended on the British for their jobs. Are you going to go against your boss? What happens if you go against your boss? You lose your job, you lose your money. So a lot of people stayed loyal to Britain because of their jobs. Some people feared the disorder that would come from challenging the established government. I mean, they didn't like the British government, but you never know what you're going to get. Would the new government be worse? Some people feared that. And they also didn't think the reasons for fighting were good enough. They didn't think unfair taxes was a good enough reason for rebellion. And this war divided families. Friends and families were divided. Benjamin Franklin and his son William were on opposite sides. His son William was a loyalist. As you know, Benjamin Franklin was one of the most famous patriots that we have. So one Connecticut loyalist observed this. Neighbor was against neighbor, father against son, and son against father. British advantages. So the British, as you can see from this picture, had the strongest navy in the world. And they had an experienced, well-trained army, and probably the strongest army in the world as well. Together, these things are called military. If you talk about the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marines, if you group those into one lump sum, you're talking about the military. So the British, their first advantage was they had a stronger military. Secondly, they had a larger population, and a larger population translated to more soldiers. And this right here is a picture of the British Empire. These are all the British holdings and the British colonies throughout the world. There's a saying that they used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, when it's daylight over in this part of the world, it's night over in this part of the world. And when it's daylight in this part of the world, it's night in this part of the world. So somewhere in the British Empire, it was always daylight. Now, what was the reason for all their colonies and all their holdings all over the place? So they could make money. And they did. So another advantage that the British had was greater wealth. Patriot disadvantages. Okay, they didn't have a regular army. They had militia. Their soldiers lacked military experience. When the fighting got tough, a lot of times they ran. They lacked a strong navy. They hardly had a navy at all. They were using merchant ships, converted merchant ships. They'd put cannons on them and turn them into warships. But they really didn't have a navy. And they lacked weapons and ammo. Those things were in short supply. And also, not all Americans supported the struggle for independence. We had a bunch of loyalists living around us. In some places, one every third person. So they had some definite disadvantages. Patriot advantages. Although they had disadvantages, they had some advantages too, and they had some good ones. So their first advantage was their military tactics. The British were used to fighting the European style, where they'd all be out in the open and they'd be all lined up in their rows. And the Americans, that's where the British were strong. The Americans didn't fight like that. They used guerrilla warfare or hit-and-run ambushes. The British weren't used to that type of fighting, and it was a safer way for the Patriots to fight because they were out in the open. They weren't out in the open where the British were strong. So the makeup of the British Army also helped America. The British relied on mercenaries or Hessians, Germans, to help them fight. And they paid them. And the Americans were fighting for a cause, and they were fighting for their families, and they were fighting for their homes. So even though they paid the mercenaries to fight, they were not going to fight as hard as the Americans were. When the fighting got tough, if you died, you weren't going to be able to spend that money. But the Americans really had no chance. They were going to have to fight to the death because they were protecting their homes. So their next advantage was the home field advantage. They fought on their own ground, and they fought hard to protect it. They fought harder than the British because they were fighting for their families. Since they knew the land, they knew the best places to get the upper hand. And the Patriots were finally united. The 13 colonies finally came together as one. They were united in their hatred for the British and their belief in freedom. Now, a lot of these things are why the Americans won the war. So, advantages continued. One of the Americans' advantages were the British were far away from their supplies. They had to ship soldiers and supplies thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. This took a long time and cost a lot of money. And probably the Americans' greatest advantage was strong leadership. George Washington may have been the best commander in the entire war on both sides. Few could match him for courage, honesty, and determination. George was well respected by everybody. He knew how to prepare an army for battle. He was successful at tricking his enemies. And he was able to win key battles like the Battle of New Jersey and the Battle of Yorktown. So they didn't have a very easy time when they tried to raise the army. Americans put great value on personal freedom. And after throwing off British rule, the Americans were unwilling to give power to their own Continental Congress. They didn't want to end up in the same situation with their government as they just got out of with the British.
If we give you too much power, you will become like Parliament. Then how are we going to raise an army?
So Congress finally established the Continental Army after hours of arguing about it. But the Continental Congress didn't have the power to raise the army. They had to ask the states. The individual states had to supply the soldiers. George Washington thought the men needed to enlist for the entire war, but most of them would only enlist for a year. Eventually, Congress offered enlistments of 3 years or the entire war. Okay, they can serve the army for 3 years. But most people still only signed up for a year. I will still only sign up for a year. I have to get back and plant my crops. So women almost fought in the war. I mean, women also fought in the war. Margaret Corbin, one woman who fought in the war, went to war with her husband, and when he was killed, she took his place.
You killed my husband, you dirty British. Take this.
Deborah Sampson watched her brothers go to war, so she disguised herself as a boy, and she went too.
My brothers fought, so I will too.
And Molly Pitcher was part of the war. The word maul means to like carry, and she was the maul of the pitcher, or the carrier of the pitcher, so her name kind of just morphed into Molly Pitcher. And Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, maul of the pitcher, or Molly Pitcher as they called her, carried pitchers of water to the soldiers. So I believe this is it today, kids. So do your note taker, make sure your note taker's done, and get your evidence questions done. When you're done with that, let's work on our notebooks and finish up all the unfinished notebooks. Thanks, and have a good day.